and welcome to an unusual Friday night at the Catholic Worker.
What a blessing to be here, Catholic Worker Center, Mary House, 55 East 3rd Street. What a blessing, what a blessing, what a blessing, what a blessing. No, we are in space that has been consecrated by some of the most courageous and visionary fellow citizens produced by this nation. And if you listen close enough, you still hear the spirits of Brother Peter Morin and Sister Dorothy Day and Robert Ludlow and the early Michael Harrington and so many others. And now we've still got Sister Martha, Brother Carmen, and so many. Now give them all a hand. Give them all a hand. The tradition goes on. The tradition goes on each time I hear the word Dorothy and the other word Day put together. It makes me shake. It makes me shudder. The way Faust shuddered in the realm of the mothers in Goethe's great classic of Faust. Examining who, in fact, am I as a human being, and how can I do better, or how can I strive to make a society that makes it easier for people to be good, in the language of Brother Peter. So I was very blessed when I was asked to say a word about Dorothy Day. It's been now almost 30 years when I first began to study assiduously her corpus, owing to my wonderful friendship and partnership and comradeship with Brother Michael Harrington. We both worked very closely, Democratic Socialists in America. We traveled the country together all through the early and mid-'80s, and then we'd steal away. He'd drink a little beer and I'd drink a little cognac. We would often talk about the Dorothy Days and the Martin Luther Kings and the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschels and the Norman Thomases. We would just call the list and go down person by person, what went into the making, acknowledging that in so many ways they were made by the movements that they were a part of. They didn't drop out of the sky. And that's very much the case for our dearly beloved Sister Dorothy Day. You can't talk about Dorothy Day without talking about John and Grace Day. We are who we are because somebody loved us. Somebody cared for us. Somebody targeted us. And yes, she was born November the 8th, 1897 in Brooklyn, New York. The greatest borough in the world. I love Manhattan, but Manhattan belongs to the world. Brooklyn is America. You all know what I'm saying? Gut bucket Americana. Manhattan, sophisticated, refined, and oh so cosmopolitan. But that's where Dorothy Day comes from. She comes out of Brooklyn and then on to my state of California. And yes, indeed, she was in the East Bay in Oakland when that earthquake hit and shook that state, or shook that section of the state for 2 minutes and 20 seconds. In so many ways, it was one of the pivotal moments in her life, even as a young person. Actually, William James was there too, lecturing at Stanford, shook the foundations of his philosophy. But she never forgot it, because early on she had intimate relations with the catastrophic. And though that's a natural catastrophe, we know that she was able to see social catastrophe, economic catastrophe, political catastrophe, ecological catastrophe. And we have to draw a radical distinction between the catastrophic and the problematic. The problematic are those who are obsessed with the mainstream and the streamline, usually obsessed with trying to gain access to it and ending up well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference. And she knew, as the great Heschel used to say, that indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself. It becomes a way of life, a hardening of the heart and a coarsening of the conscience, a chilling of the soul, turning one's back to the vulnerable, turning one's back to the despised and the weak. But William James would also say indifference is the one trait that makes the very angels weep. And how do you shift from that chilliness and that numbness to being on fire? And she understood, as did Martin King and as did John Coltrane, that in the end it's about a love supreme. I would hope you all get a chance in the next week to read that section in her classic, The Long Loneliness, called Love Overflows, and listen to it against the backdrop of a love supreme. And if Coltrane's a little bit too much for you, maybe you want to listen to a little Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. Because you got a whole lot of love there, but you're going to have words in that. And I want you to keep track of Sister Dorothy's text. Because when you think of Dorothy Day, you think of love overflowing. But it's not abstract, it's not ephemeral, it's not fleeting. It is rooted and grounded in the catastrophic. That's why she takes so seriously line 38 of Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. But she understood, as Malcolm X always said, the examined life is painful. It takes courage to cut against the grain, nonconformist, being willing to bear witness to something grander than you. And she always acted as if she were part of something bigger than her. She was fundamentally tied into forms of conversion. She was first converted, interesting, by text. She was an intellectual. She loved the life of the mind. She was engaged in the world of ideas. It was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It was Jack London's The Road that changed her and led her to fall in love with those Sly Stone called everyday people. Or those James Cleveland called ordinary people. Now in her day they called it the masses. But she corrected them, especially after her Christian conversion, after her time with our beloved secular leftist intellectuals and playwrights and artists and activists. She said, no, they're not masses, they're people. They're temples of the Holy Spirit. They're made in the image and likeness of God, which means each and every one of them, like you, like me, unique, distinctive, irreducible, irreproducible, no one like us. And never will be any individual like us. That's not masses, which is homogeneous and monolithic, that allows you to take a detached disposition, oftentimes to view them as objects of manipulation rather than subjects that one has an I-thou relation with, in the language of our dear brother Martin Buber. How do we stay in contact with the rich humanity of each and every person? What begins with the Socratic, the examine life. And we know from the Greek, it says that examine life is not a life for the human. And our English word human derives from the Latin humando, and humando means what? Burying. Humanity, humility, tied to burying. We're on our way to death. Sister Dorothy never forgot the most terrifying question that we will ever raise to ourselves. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? That's who we are. And that's what I love about Sister Dorothy, that she had a resistance to deodorized discourses about human beings. She always kept it funky. She kept it real. Our dear brother Tom Cornell in our magnificent Mass, I was so blessed to be there and be a part of it. He talked about Dorothy Day's authenticity. She was genuine. She was the real thing. What you see was what you got. She was able to bring together head and heart and soul and body and allow her whole being and her whole voice to be heard. And yes, she changed her mind. Why? Because she was Socratic. She believed in relentless self-criticism, self-scrutiny, self-interrogation. But she also knew that in the end, if you're wrestling with what it is to be human, you have to make some very difficult and painful choices if you take seriously your quest from mama's womb to tomb to bear witness to something greater than you. And of course for her, it was always centered on the fundamental love. Even in her pre-Christian years, she fell in love with wisdom. Very much like Socrates. Socrates fell in love with wisdom. But Dorothy Day found wisdom in the greatest literary tradition in the modern world, the Russians. Oh yes, Dostoevsky, Kirillov, in The Possessed. I've always been haunted by God. I could hear her reading that over. I can see her reading that over and over again. Yes, Sister Dorothy, we see your soul mirrored in the soul wrestling of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who also was on intimate terms with the prison cell, like yourself. You could see it in Dostoevsky's definition of hell in one of her favorite novels, and one of the greatest novels of all time, The Brothers Karamazov, where Dostoevsky says what? Hell is suffering from the incapacity to love. That's his psychological definition of it. Very much like Hamlet. He suffers from the incapacity to love. He doesn't really love Ophelia. What do you love, Hamlet? Well, I thought I loved ideas, but even the ideas are leading me to such a radical skepticism that the melancholy is overcoming me. Do I really have the capacity to love, especially love my neighbor, not just love abstract principles, philosophical reflection, or wisdom in the broad sense? Do you love that fallible, finite creature next to you? And do you love that poor, unloved, uncared for child living on the other side of town? Dorothy Day, building on her love of literature, and I say that in all explicitness, because for her, art was in no way a form of artificial entertainment or narrow stimulation. It had to do with nurturing her soul and refining her sense of who she was so that her armor became thicker, her spiritual armor, her moral, her political, her communal armor became thicker in her move from John and Grace Day to November 1980, when she experienced what we all will, the culinary delight of terrestrial worms coming at our bodies, the end of our death sentence in time and space, and looking forward to the next stage.
based on your theology. But this issue of death is crucial. And you see it in her text over and over again. I had to learn how to die in order to live well. That's what she says. In The Long Loneliness, I think it's about page 107. It's a powerful line. It echoes Plato's philosophy, love of wisdom, is a meditation on and preparation for death. It echoes section 20, book 1 of Montaigne's great collection of essays that says to philosophize is to learn how to die. It echoes even Seneca. We don't expect too much death out of the Romans. They're too preoccupied with imperial adventures. But even Seneca, when he says, he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. Unlearns slavery. And from the very beginning, Dorothy Day says, I'm not going to be a death-dodging, death-ducking human being. And see, American culture, in so many ways, is a death-dodging, death-denying culture. That's why when you turn to the U.S. Constitution, you see no reference to the social death, slavery, in its myth. No reference whatsoever to it. So you begin innocent, Peter Pan-like, forever young. So we can grow rich, grow wealthy, but never grow up. Nor where's the maturation? Where's the effort to wrestle with forms of death? From the very beginning, Dorothy Day was a death wrestler. Psychic death. Wrestling with self-doubt, guilt, spiritual death. Am I a non-entity? Am I a non-person? Not simply wrestling with patriarchal structures, but also acknowledging, even in her interactions with some of the most sophisticated secular intellectuals, the Michael Golds and Eugene O'Neill, who was mentioned, probably the greatest American playwright alongside Brother Tennessee Williams and August Wilson, that there seemed to be a depth that was missing there, given all of their genius. You see. Dorothy Day understood that if you're going to be a death wrestler, there's a very good chance that you're going to spend a lot of time on the margins, in prisons, and you're on your way to a cross. And in that process of on your way to a cross, you will be a cross bearer, much more than a flag waver. That patriotism in its dominant form, as we see with this drone, is a form of idolatry that too often leaves us callous and indifferent to the suffering of others. So given all of our utterances, we don't want to acknowledge the degree to which those precious babies in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan have exactly the same value and significance as a precious white baby in Newtown, Connecticut, a precious black baby in the south side of Chicago, a precious yellow baby in Minneapolis with our brothers and sisters from Laos, or a precious brown baby in the barrios in East Los Angeles. It sounds simple, but it is profoundly subversive if you take it seriously. Dorothy Day took it seriously, and she was willing to pay the cost and bear the burden. Dorothy Day understood that Socratic questioning was necessary but not sufficient condition in order to bear the kind of witness that she was called to do. We know, of course, that Socrates is known for not shedding a tear. He never cries. We don't see it in Plato. We don't see it in Xenophon. We certainly don't see it in the satirical depiction of Socrates and Aristophanes' The Clouds. What is it about Socrates that he's both paradigmatic in terms of his questioning, but he doesn't shed a tear? Thomas More wrestled with this question in the Tower of London, didn't he, in his dialogues on tribulation. Why is it Socrates does not cry? Now he added, why is it that Jesus doesn't laugh? But we won't get into that right now. He's on his way to death. But Dorothy Day understood anybody who's never cried has never deeply loved one's neighbor or a concrete human being. Because life is not just about self-mastery and self-control. It's about love overflowing. When you at the funeral of your loved one, your mother in the coffin, or your sister or brother about to be buried, and tears flow unceasingly, you are expressing your humanity, because tears are signs of deep attachment and compassion and empathy and love. And you ought not to be ashamed of it. You ought to view it as an expression at that moment of something that is overflowing and overwhelming for you. And yet it ought to take some concrete form in the society in which you live. Because that same empathy and compassion, no matter how mediated or attenuated, ought to connect you to others, especially those who are disproportionately suffering and invisible, whose humanity is overlooked, as it were. And so she moved to the legacy of Jerusalem, wrestling with her beloved husband, Forster, or a beloved companion, Forster, let me say. Beloved love companion, Forster. What is my relation to the legacy of Jerusalem, specifically embodied in the Catholic tradition? Now, you could imagine how heavy that question was, because I'm a Holy Ghost Free Baptist. And when I raise the question of the legacy of Jerusalem, it takes a while to get to the Catholic Church. And I know how rich that tradition is. There's no such thing as Baptists without the Catholic Church. We needed somebody to rebel against, you know. No reformation and protestant without what you're protesting against. The Roman Catholic Church in all of its richness and depth, and in all of its blindnesses and limitations, all of its virtues, all of its vices, all of its generating magnificent forms of resistance, and all of its complicities to structures of domination. I think of Mary Ward, who of course was the grand founder of the Congregation of Jesus and the Sisters of Loreto, which is where that title comes from, the long loneliness. She invokes that rich history of Catholic sisters, and this is an English Catholic sister, in trying somehow to understand her calling and how could she best enact and embody the gospel and be true to herself as a critic of the very institution that enabled her to be a witness bearer. It's always paradox. It's always a kind of contradiction. That's true for each and every one of us to the degree to which we are tied to any community in any institution. But Dorothy Day brought together the rich spirituality of questioning that began with her falling in love with poor people and working people, then her falling in love with Jesus, trying to find the Christ hidden in each and every person, especially the least of these, especially the poor and the marginal. And so that double kind of conversion, or two waves of conversion, had to do with the turning of her soul from frivolous, fleeting things to the most substantial things of life and death and joy and sorrow. And for those 83 years that she was here in space and time with us in terms of human beings, there's probably some people here who actually knew her. I never got a chance to see a
meet my sister. I think if I did, I probably would be so humbled and paralyzed that I couldn't say a word. I would just give her a hug, and she would say, okay, that's long enough, that's long enough. But she would understand where it was coming from, because it comes from the same tradition of that brother right there, Martin Luther King Jr., was hugging her all the time, just as she was hugging him all the time. If you get a chance, you read what she wrote when Brother Martin was shot down like a dog in Memphis, Tennessee, in that 1968 April issue of the Catholic Worker. What was the first line of that powerful, powerful statement? She said, Martin Luther King died daily, as St. Paul said. That he learned how to die in order to learn how to live well. And you learn how to die Socratically by killing prejudice, killing prejudgment, killing presuppositions that get in the way of the love overflow. And any time you give up a set of assumptions and presuppositions, that is a form of death. And there is no rebirth without death. There's no maturation without death. There's no growth. There's no development without death. I tell my students every class, Princeton, Harvard, and Union, you come in this classroom to learn how to die. They kind of look around, am I in the right place? I thought I'd read some text and get a diploma, get a degree, and get a job in some vanilla suburb. No. You're here to learn how to die. Because we're going to engage in some critical self-examination. Let's see what history has deposited in us. Let's come to terms with our prejudices. Let's come to terms with our dogmatic sensibilities. Let's come to terms with the insecurity, the fear, the greed, the envy, the jealousy that shot through every human soul, no matter what color, culture, or civilization, or sexual orientation. And in the short time that you're here, we're going to see how far you go. And in the end, in the language of that wonderful lapsed Christian Samuel Beckett, you're going to try again, fail better. You're going to try again, fail better. And when you meet your death, the question will be, how good is your failure? Because you're going to fall on your faith, as Sister Dorothy says, over and over and over again in her text. How do we learn, like Martin, like St. Paul said, like Dorothy Day enacted in her life, how to die inside of ourselves? Now, here is the major challenge. That she understood, rightly, that love is a form of death. So if you're death denying, you're never able to cultivate the capacity to love. And this is what's the problem of market culture. You see, the culture of superficial spectacle. It doesn't get down to the deep, funky stuff of love. It's highly superficial. And this is one of the problems of our young people these days. I've taught in prisons now for 32 years. It's incredible the degree to which, when they experience the real thing, love, it scares them to death. It's alien. They have little sense of what to do with it, because it's not something to manipulate. It's not something to instrumentalize. It's not something just take advantage of for short-term gain. But that's what they're told over and over again. Life is about what? It's about instrumental thinking. It's about market calculation. It's about status, about power, it's about wealth, it's about visibility. No, it's about integrity. Did you say cupidity? No, integrity. It's about honesty. It's about decency. It's about a quest for virtue. Think of Dorothy Day. Think of Du Bois's questions. How does integrity face oppression? Look at her life and see. How does honesty face deception, lies, mendacity,
especially from powers that be, given the wickedness in high places. Look at her life in the movement represented by this very institution. How does decency respond to insult? You could write a whole history of all the trashing of the Catholic worker movement and of Dorothy Day. It's a powerful moment in her diary, The Duty of Delight. We thank Brother Robert Ellsberg for editing that magnificent text. She says everything around her is full of hate. I don't know what to do. I'm in despair. I'm wrestling with darkness. I feel like Jacob in the 32nd chapter of Genesis. I'm wrestling with the angel of death against the backdrop, the catastrophic backdrop of the midnight hour. And I am wounded. And I emerge with a new name from Jacob to Israel, which means what? God wrestler. And I'll be a wrestler till the day I die. But in the end, love will have the last word for Dorothy Day, because she was in fact a woman, not just of faith. She was a sister of what we in the Black Baptist tradition call thick faith. We got a whole lot of folk in the pew that got faith, but I'm talking about the ones that got that thick faith, the ones that go all the way down. Dorothy Day reminds me in so many ways of Toni Morrison. You know, Toni Morrison's Catholic. A lot of people don't realize that. She's one of the great Catholic writers like Flannery O'Connor. She has an incarnational conception of human existence. We Protestants are too individualistic. I think we need to learn from Catholics. Always centered on community. And when Dorothy Day talks about the long loneliness, when Dorothy Day talks about the darkness, when Dorothy Day talks about wrestling in the darkness like Jacob, she knows the only thing that can break is a love that overflows into community. It's got to be incarnational. And yes, the Eucharist is transubstantiation in the sense that it reflects a degree to which a miracle can take place, a mystery can be enacted in which our egos, our narcissism can be connected to something positive called a beloved community, a kingdom of God that can lure us out of our fallenness and fallitude into something that constitutes a force for good, as long as we're courageous enough to choose to stay on that tightrope. And we fall on our faces continually, over and over again. But we don't trump each other's possibilities, which means we can love our enemies. Because no matter what our enemies are doing at the moment, their deeds does not fully define their humanity. They can change in the same way you have changed in your own lives, and you don't want to be frozen in any particular moment that definitively defines you. I mean, as a Black Baptist, I know I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and the best I'll ever be is a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities and gangster memories. And hence the need for grace to fall back on something that can sustain me. Dorothy Day had that kind of thick faith. And that's what allowed her to straighten her back up, go to jail and wrestle with that solitary confinement those 10 days. You get a chance to read that section, Jail in the Long Loneliness. My God. It's not just about the melancholic. It's not just about the futility of life. It's about the sheer absurdity of life. What do you do in the face of the sheer absurdity of life when you're not even concerned about being a hero anymore? You're dealing with something so arbitrary, so contingent, there's nothing to bounce off against your agency. That's the absurd. She understood it. When a faith, a religious faith, in her case a Christian faith, confronts that level, that's what Kierkegaard is. That's what Dostoevsky is. That's what Coltrane was after his 10 years of the heroin addict. That's what Mary Lou Williams was when she converted to Catholicism after her secular years as a jazz musician, owing to Brother Barry Ulanoff, our dear Jewish brother, literary critic who became a Catholic as well.
who was close to Mary Lou Williams, influenced by Dorothy Day, enabling a bringing together of that deep spiritual wrestling with radical political engagement. Well, how do we then appropriate critically Dorothy Day in the spirit of Dorothy Day? Well, the first thing we need to do is we have to accent a rare virtue these days, which is courage to tell the truth. And the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. But telling the truth does not pay in a market-driven society. You have to pay a cost. And that cost cannot be measured in terms of the society in which we live or even the world that we inhabit. And so we end up with what? We have a whole culture. I hear this all the time, especially my young brothers and sisters of all colors. Oh, I just want to be smart. I just want to be smart. No, let the phones be smart. You be wise. Oh, he's so smart. You see that in the New York Times more and more. Oh, this is a smart book. This is smart. It says nothing. You think Kafka was a smart short story writer? You think Chekhov's plays, somebody say, oh, Three Sisters, that's a smart play. Please. It shows how spiritually empty. Smart has to do with access, manipulation of information and data. It has to do with being smart alecky. They get a certain attention. It has to do usually with connecting smartness to big dollars so that the hedge fund folk are so smart. Well, what does that make Dorothy Day then? Broke as the Ten Commandments financially. Spiritually as rich as one could ever imagine. She was wise and courageous. How do we do that today? By example, in the same way she did. By example. Tell the truth about the new Jim Crow. I know we got a black president. That's a beautiful thing. It just shows that our white brothers and sisters are less racist than their parents or grandparents. That's beautiful, but that's not worth breakdancing over. So, oh, Brother West, that's progress. Absolutely, that is progress. Brother Malcolm used to say, what, you don't stab folk in the back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, and celebrate your progress. No. You got black faces in the White House, but my God. When you look in the basement of the American empire, start with the reservations, then go to poor white brothers and sisters in Appalachia, then go to the working class with stagnating wages, then go to the brown folk wrestling with massive unemployment, then get to the black hood, and of course black folk, we tend to be the litmus test. Not because we have any kind of monopoly on truth, goodness, or beauty, but because the legacy of white supremacy is such that it constitutes a major form of social death in the shaping of the culture, the imagination, and the economy of the United States. So when you keep track of how Sister Letitia and Brother Jamal are doing on the block, that ought to be the focus as opposed to Brother Barack in the White House. Oh my God, let's celebrate. No, Dorothy Day would say, Brother West, are you in any way committed to what I was committed to? Because if I was still going 33 years later, I'd be trying to tell the truth about stop and frisk. I'd be telling the truth about the rule of big money. I'd be telling the truth about why it is we have a criminal justice system that itself cannot manage to put one Wall Street executive to jail, to send to jail after massive criminality, insider trading, market manipulation, fraudulent accounting across the board. And when they get caught, what do? Market calculation. How much money do you want? 13 billion, JP Morgan. Okay, we got it. Tax write-off. Not one taking personal responsibility. And yet this is the same ruling class with major
ideologues representing its interests that say to poor people, when you make bad choices, you must have personal responsibility. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We don't believe in somehow reaching out to give you bailouts, and yet when they get in trouble, $787 billion and $85 billion every month for over 2.5 years with the Federal Reserve System. And we wonder how it is and why it is that we're wrestling with such cultural decay in terms of the forms of soulcraft, especially among our young people. What forms of life dominate their world? Wu-Tang put it well. Cream. Cash rules everything around me. But it doesn't have to rule me. I can choose to be different. I can choose to cut against the grain. Dorothy Day chose to cut against the grain. Sister Dorothy, what else could we learn from you? Well, you've got to connect the spiritual to the social, the existential to the economic, and the personal to the political. Because if you're going to be a long-distance runner against the American imperial forces, you have got to be so well equipped if you're going to survive. You've got to be your soul intact. You're going to need such spiritual resources so that you don't end up selling out or caving in or giving up. And Dorothy Day is like Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer. She never sold out. She held on to her integrity until the very end. That's a rare thing. Her generation, this generation. She never gave up. She wrestled with nihilism. She wrestled with melancholy. She wrestled with despair and darkness and bleakness, but she allowed the love and community to have the last words. And the challenge is, how do we talk publicly about that kind of love and that sense of community with a radical analysis that goes far beyond the political spectrum? We've got corporate media now with Fox, with cold-hearted right-wing Republican Party policies, and MSNBC with milquetoast, spineless, neoliberal Democratic Party policy. And that's the choice, the right and the left. No. Far right and right. We haven't even got to the center yet, hardly. That's how far things have moved in a conservative way from even the time of Dorothy Day. That's why her spirit is so radically needed, and that's why we're here today, to ensure, to let the world know, Sister Dorothy, we love you. Sister Dorothy, we will never, ever forget you. Sister Dorothy, your conception of piety, which is tied to remembrance of those love warriors of the past who revered something bigger than themselves, in her case, God and church and kingdom of God and beloved community, and it generated a resistance that made very little sense in the eyes of the world. But it makes all the sense in the world, because like that Russian literary tradition that she was so deeply grounded in, where the heroes are usually holy fools. And the question is, can we be holy fools against the worldly foolishness tied to indifference and callousness? To be a holy fool is to be on fire with a love, a commitment to justice, a willingness to pay, that people had to sit back and say, maybe there was a time when that kind of fire could spread. But lo and behold, any historical moment when there's enough holy fools on fire can spread like a prairie fire
and affect others, become contagious, shatter their sleepwalking, wake them up, let them straighten their backs up and stand up for justice. Dorothy, thank you. Dorothy, we thank you.
God bless y'all. Thank you very much. You all very patient, very patient. Thank you so very much, though. We'll have time for questions. There's time for question and answer.
And going to take questions.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, though. No, I'll begin with third, second, and first, though.
No, I think that you really can't talk about discourse of love in the most barbaric and bestial of all recorded time, which is the 20th century, without talking about the musical witness of John Coltrane. Of course, Coltrane didn't fall out of the sky either. He's dealing with depths of loneliness and melancholy and the death of his father and grandmother and grandfather, all within a matter of months, living by himself, blowing his horn, hoping he could bring his father back as a young person. And then on with Miles and others, and then heroin addiction, and then the breakthrough. We got Sister Christine right here who heads the Coltrane for Kids. She has a magnificent program that brings Coltrane's music to 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old, 10-year-olds, and so forth. And we've seen magnificent results because Coltrane opens up. He opens you up. But of course, you know, we see the cutback in schools doing what? Cutbacks on arts programs across the board. So we got young folk who don't know how to play instruments at all. They haven't been exposed to them. And some of them can't sing in tune and still make big money. Because it's all about superficial status and the spectacular presence. I mean, that's one reason why a Jill Scott or an Angie Stone is not appreciated in the way in which she ought, but Beyonce can soar. And Beyonce's a great entertainer, but she can't sing half as good as Kim Burrell. Kim doesn't have a chance because the culture is so superficial. You see, Nina Simone would hardly have a chance these days. Giant that she is. I was just in her hometown just 2 days ago in Asheville, North Carolina, with another tribute to her and Thomas Wolfe. They both come out of Asheville. That second question had to do with, is he a Republican, a Rockefeller Republican in blackface? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because the Republican Party now is so far right-wing, Nixon would be progressive vis-a-vis this Republican Party. And he was a war criminal, bona fide war criminal. You see what I mean? But I mean, you know, people misunderstand. Well, you're so hard on him. No, I'm just trying to be metaphorical to get people to think, to understand the degree to which our political discourse has so thoroughly degenerated that he's calling for cuts in Social Security, he's calling for cuts in Medicare. That's Republican Party talk. The Obamacare was Romney Care, which came out of the Heritage Foundation. We'd have so much more to fight for if it was single payer. He knows that. We'd really have something to fight for. But it's going to be a bonanza for the health insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies making gobs of money because it expands their market. Now, of course, it's a good thing that our precious poor brothers and sisters get access to insurance, but the money still will go up. The profits will still be at the center of things. It's still a market-centered project. The software too, and slices of the of doctors and so forth and so on. There's a whole host of folk in it. And look at all the consultants now that's in it, making big money, even when they mess up. You see? So that's what I mean by, because I mean Rockefeller Republicans in that day, you know, they were pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, often pro-patriarchy, pro-homophobic, but more progressive than this Republican Party. That first question had to do with Tibet. Oh, you're absolutely right, though, brother. I think anytime we talk about occupied peoples, it could be Sub-Sahara under Morocco, it could be Palestinian brothers and sisters under Israeli occupation, it's Chinese occupation of Tibet, and it ought to be part and parcel. I'd say the same thing about the Turkish domination of Kurds. We can go on and on. We have to be
honest, we have to be morally consistent, we have to have what Jane Austen called constancy, where you have a morality that allows you to be honest and candid, that takes you across national borders. And in the end, we have to be internationalists, the way Sister Dorothy Day was. Radical internationalists, not be caught by flags. The cross is international, cosmopolitan, global, signifying unarmed truth and unconditional love for everybody. That's what Sister Dorothy understood. That's one of the great contributions of the legacies of Jerusalem that begins with our Jewish brothers and sisters with the spreading of hesed and loving kindness to the stranger and widow and the weak and vulnerable, and then the great breakthrough of Jesus himself, Jewish brother like Hillel and other Jewish brothers, that says this love ought to be at the center of things, and it cuts across not just stranger, but even enemy. Even enemy. Don't lose sight of the humanity of your very foe, which makes no sense in terms of the world. That's why you don't try it on your own. You're going to need a whole lot of grace for that. But we'll have another three.
I got one, two,
Yeah.
three. Jane, 1, 2, 3. You'll be next.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
One thing I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about Dorothy's legacy was this fundamental distrust in the organs and agents of economic and political domination
Yes,
to
yes.
bring about economic and political liberation, and therefore the need for us ourselves to bring about building a new society, the idea of feeding the hungry as a revolutionary act. And I'm wondering, in particular, given the strong ties in the Catholic worker tradition and in Dorothy Day's legacy, between that on the one hand and on the other, not sort of seeping into this charity model, but actually also engaging in radical community organizing. How do we connect personalism and community organizing in our social movements against the new Jim Crow and against international occupation today?
Yes, a wonderful question. I mean, part of the problem is that the public spaces have so radically contracted. Because the three dominant tendencies of neoliberal capitalist regimes, which is to financialize, and we've seen the financialization of the economy. 42% of the profits now go to big banks, mainly Wall Street. In Dorothy Day's day, it was multinational corporations. American Motors, for example. They were producing cars. Now it's Wall Street producing deals with no productive value in the economy as a whole, at least producing cars that generate jobs. And you got strong trade union movements. The wages can go up when the profits go up. Trade union movement weakens, profits go up, wages stagnate. But producing deals, there's no way you can get to it. It's unaccountable. And once they have completely colonized and dominated the politicians and government and Congress, you end up with a very, very truncated oligarchic rule in that sense. So then the question becomes, well, how as citizens do we organize communities, bear witness, bring power and pressure to bear? The two-party system is just as dead as a doornail in terms of its ability to generate any kind of serious progressive possibilities, and yet we still have to work with it. We got a new mayor now. We're going to see what he does. Yeah, but his first move is to bring in folk from the establishment, even for his transition team, because he comes out of the Clintonite camp, right? But we still are glad that he's better than some of the other brother who's running. I don't know what his name was. He just was a scary brother, you know. Oh, yeah. Not on the conservative side. So what public space do we have? We have the streets, but the streets, mechanisms of repression, moving complete. I know many of you were part of Occupy. It was a beautiful, magnificent, sublime development to see everyday people straighten their backs up and come together in that way, you see. But then you've got national surveillance, spies, police, prison, easily cast a shadow over it for co-optation or repression, you see. And you've got forms of rebellion, which are unpredictable. They're not reformers, they're not revolutionary, it's just people reach the point where they can't take it any longer.
Disorder is a threat to the powers that be. It might not be generated by a correct analysis and sophisticated understanding of their operations of power, but you get everyday people upset and they begin to rebel, all of a sudden concessions begin to be made. That's what the 60s was about. Brother Martin, in so many ways, his death generated more social change than his practice. It's because he had loved folks so deeply that when he was killed, that love overflowed into the streets. And the powers that be said, oh my God, I think we really do have a problem now. Because 212 cities were experiencing rebellion, you see. And that's something that the powers that be take very seriously. Very silly. It was John F. Kennedy himself who said what? If you make peaceful change impossible, you make violent change inevitable. And that's John F. Kennedy. Now, he's no grand progressive. Come out right out of the establishment, Harvard College, and so forth and so on. But he was right about that. And Dorothy Day knew that violence itself tends to reinforce the cycle of violence no matter where it comes from, because it allows people to lose sight of the humanity of others and become callous and indifferent in the way that I was talking. So what do? Well, we got very, very limited terrain, and you try to expand it as much as you can with a variety of different tactics and strategies, and that's where progressives and leftists need to continue the conversation in terms of what kind of strategy.
Yeah. Our society... Our society gives us just enough so that we want to hold on to really tight. And I think of Christ with the rich young man who followed all the rules. Christ loved that man. And he said, sell your possessions and come and follow me. And the young man had to turn away. Christ was sad. And upon my personal self-reflection, I fear I'm that person who's taken that little taste of what that little cracker that society gave me, and I'm holding on tight to it. What would you say to all of us who don't want to let go of that little piece to find what the great gift that Dorothy Day found?
It's a wonderful question, no, brother. It's a wonderful question, definitely. You know, it's a fascinating moment in her corpus where she says that the lowest moment in the life of Jesus was when he was subject to the temptation. The temptation essentially was to give up on loving one's fellow neighbors and opt for power. And if we're going to be followers of Jesus, I'm talking to Christians at this point, the question becomes, we know that we're always already locked into that little bit that you're talking about. Because you describe not just yourself, you describe everybody in this room for the most part. For the most, I know we got some real bona fide saints in here. I'm not talking about you, but no, I'm just kidding. Because I mean, a saint ain't nothing but a sinner that looks at the world through the lens of the heart. See, so a saint's honest about his or her fallenness, but opt for the love that flows from heart and soul. But that fallenness is tied to that bit that you're talking about. So the question becomes, how do you courageously wrestle with it on your own? Meditation. I didn't talk about the crucial role of prayer. Of course, prayer was at the center of her life. Sacrament at the center of her life. She said explicitly what? Without the sacraments, I cannot go on. I mean, it doesn't get any more gut bucket and visceral and bare than that. And that is deeply Catholic. That's not Protestant at all. Because we got a few sacraments and we moving quick through them. That's true. Real quick. Marriage and Eucharist. Get to the sermon. No, sermon. Anybody can say anything. Let's break bread together. Remember the last lines of The Long Loneliness where it says that it's in breaking bread that we come to know God. And it's in breaking bread together that we come to know neighbor. And that breaking bread is Eucharist. It's that particular practice of community that does what? It remembers, given our dismemberment.
That's why it's in remembrance of me, because you come dismembered. You come thoroughly disoriented, like we did just a few hours ago with Brother George and Brother Tom and the others. And in that Mass, in that Eucharist, for that wonderful moment, we really were community, very much so. And that's the community that will hold you from allowing that bit in your hand to become an idol. But you do hold on to the bit. I mean, Brother Peter makes a distinction between poverty and being destitute, because he thought poverty was a desirable thing. That's his right to think that. Because he, like Sister Dorothy, was so spiritually rich. And we know in our long tradition of our sisters and nuns and brothers and monks and so forth, who have made such great contributions, preserved civilization, they choose poverty and chastity and so forth. That's their choice. Not my choice. That's their choice. But there's a richness in that choice, because it's about a resistance of forms of idolatry, and that's a challenge for all of us in that way, you see. And that's part of the challenge, a sense of community. And that was part of the question earlier, how do you create community among progressives that can be sustained given certain tactics and so, yes.
From the Living Theater.
Oh, yes.
Hi.
How are you doing? It's so good to see you.
I think a lot about Fredy Perlman, the great anarchist, and his book Against Leviathan, Against History, and how we have become so entrenched in the machine that we are part of the Leviathan. And yet, we were so subverted, and have been and continue to be so subverted in this political morass. We are no longer oppressed by it. What is your opinion of the idea of completely disengaging from the legislative, political, governing, oligarchical model and really concentrating on a new kind of a vision, that completely bypasses this middle person of government and the ruling class?
Yeah, that is an elephant in the room. I'll tell you that, because that's a $64,000. Well, I shouldn't put it in monetary terms. That's the fundamental question. See, I tend to be one that builds on the Negro National Anthem, lift every voice. So I have a certain respect for people who radically disengage if they're creating new communities that prefigure the kind of society they're fighting for. But I don't think there's just one model for progressives. There's always going to be people who make that choice. There's always going to be people who remain engaged. So the question is, how are we able to still create forms of coming together, that kind of unity and diversity and unity, where we share some deep values and practices with those who have disengaged themselves. And at the same time, we recognize you got folks who are deeply engaged in government, deeply engaged in fights at the workplace with the class struggle going on, and of course the class struggle being intensified from above the last 30 years with that massive transfer of wealth from poor working people to the well-to-do. I was talking about the three tendencies of neoliberal regime, the financializing, privatizing, and militarizing. They all go hand in hand. They all go hand in hand. So if you got 1% of the population, you got 95% of the income in the last 4 years, and 1% of the population owns 43% of the wealth, and yet they're able to make this a priority, make drones a priority, killing innocent folk, innocent children. And yet children here in America get cut back when it comes to food stamps, education decrepit, neighborhoods shot through with massive unemployment, bullets flowing, drugs flowing, and so forth. You say, well, if we disengage, does that allow the oligarchs and plutocrats who are already engaged to more readily reshape the larger society as we know it? That's part of the conversation that needs to take place. I tend to be, or at least I try to be, jazz-like. And what I mean by that is that, in my own life, in my own calling, I'll spend time with folk who are disengaged because I can learn something from it, to say communities and so forth, way out in New Hampshire, and I don't go to Idaho too often, but Oregon and so forth. Then I moved right back into black communities, white working class, Arab communities, Muslim communities, Jewish communities, atheistic, and agnostic intellectuals and others, because you try to be multi-contextual. So when you lift your voice in such a way, it bounces off against all of these voices. But I think in the end, we're going to have some kind of major social movement, major social coming together. We don't know how that's going to take place. It could be that the escalating levels of repression of the national surveillance state, of the national security state, and the increasing repression, both here and other parts of the world, will push us all in the same corner. You say, well, you disengage, you engage now, we going to jail together. We didn't demonize together. So it becomes a very different kind of moment. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more round. 1, 2, 3.
Where was the one? Oh, yeah.
Oh, I apologize. As a speaker who touches on international issues, as a speaker who draws from very important speakers from multiple religious practices, as an individual who moves as an educator from Harvard to prisons, is there a community that you feel a part of and that you feel the individuals you have the opportunity to speak with share beyond this religiosity, beyond these identities of class, that you also share, have been instrumental to connecting with them?
Well, that's a good question, though. I mean, given, let's call it hybridity. Some people call it confusion, but you call it hybridity. Religious left, tied to secular left, tied to deep democratic projects, but part of intellectual discussions where, I teach courses with deeply conservative academics, Brother Robert George and the others. We teach great books and so forth. We go at it and have a wonderful time because I believe in public conversation. You see, in our society, the public as a whole has been so degraded that public conversation, public transportation, public education, right across the board, the trash. It's all about privatizing. So public education itself can become actually not just a force for good, but even a counter-hegemonic force. And that's very crucial, given the dumbing down that takes place in corporate media. So that I don't think there's just one community that I would point to. I spent time with Democratic Socialists of America. I've been co-chair, of course, there for ever since Brother Harrington was mentioned, passed, with Barbara Ehrenreich and some other towering freedom fighters in our day. On Sundays, you find me in church. A lot of people say, well, no, we don't want to get too close to that part of the West. The Holy Ghost is hitting, right now, that's who I am. Saturday night, I'm rocking too. Some other thing. I'm not talking about strip clubs, but I'm talking about soul music. Because I believe music as a fundamental source of soul formation. But it's very interesting for the younger generation because they can't play the instruments, but they don't have groups like the main ingredients in blue magic and temptations and dramatics, because you have to learn how to listen. You got to cultivate a faculty of receptivity. It's not just about you. You got to listen to hear your voice bounced off against other voices. And for the most part, it's so individualistic these days, especially in hip-hop. It's just you and the microphone and the people rapping. So, well, could we just have a group singing harmony softly? Well, we haven't practiced that. I didn't think so. And you see, that's a cultural statement. Because that's part of community, too. That's part of community, too. Thank God we've got jazz movements teaching young people instruments. Where you have to learn how to listen very well in order to find your voice. That's reciprocal, that's mutual, that's community building, and it's virtue shaping as well. So that I don't really have one community in that particular way, but in just a context, I find myself.
So I question the basics of the system we live under, called capitalism. Okay? There's something wrong with the system when so many millions of people are suffering So what concerns me is where do you think this is headed? Because the last time we were in a situation as similar to this, one thing pulled us out. That was World War II. Now, if you think we need a war to keep your economy going, that is not Christian-like, that's pretty sad, horrific.
Yeah, no, you eloquent, my brother. I agree with you 100%. In fact, I mean, I think that we were making comments tilted in your direction in terms of the critique.
That's why I had to say.
So I'm glad you just made it more explicit. Absolutely, you did it with great power. Now, of course, with Manny, she's Chelsea now.
Yeah.
So we want to keep that in mind. He's Chelsea man. But the point is, courage, cut against the grain, exposing crimes and lies of the government. But I would add this, though, brother. You tell me what you think. I think that the dominant tendencies in our society are moving toward first a soft, then a hard fascism. That's where it's headed if we don't counter it. And that soft fascism that has a strong militaristic wing externally and a strong militaristic wing internally for the vulnerable, for the poor. The middle classes and upper classes don't feel the repressive impact the way the poor do. That's why Stop and Frisk was fundamental. That's why Brother Carl Dix of the Revolutionary Communist Party and I went to jail to try to highlight it 2 years ago. Because the fascist possibilities are an outright, full-fledged authoritarian state. We already had a soft authoritarian state. Snowden showed that. It is real. And then war comes in to somehow provide jobs, unemployment, and so forth. But it's the coming together of big money, big corporations, big banks, and big government. And that's one of the reasons why anarchism is so strong among the young brothers and sisters of all colors on the left. And I resonate with them that anarchism is always suspicious of highly concentrated forms of power, be it in the public sector or be it in the private sector, especially when it's captured by oligarchic interests that are pitted against everyday people. And so there's a sense in which we need to talk explicitly about fascism as well as a possibility, not just the possibility of a war that could bail us out and reproduce the same capitalist hierarchies and the same class hierarchies. We got another, where is it? Yes. Appreciate your patience.
Thank you. You were talking about the social ills, you know, you were talking about that tipping point that you know, people have had it up to here. We see all the images now. We see the problems in Syria. We see the building collapsing in Bangladesh. We see the two wars here. So what's keeping this? What's the difference between this time and the time that Dr. King was leading all those people in the mall? I mean, why are we not doing more? Why are not everybody, not just people in this room, but why don't the everyday people do more? The ordinary people, the masses.
Yeah, that's a good question, though, brother. I mean, one is that we've got such a pervasive culture of distractions. Now, there have always been cultures of distractions in any society in terms of the powers that be at the top trying to create different ways of life to keep them far removed from organizing, mobilizing, and bringing pressure and power to bear. But now with these unbelievably sophisticated technological instruments, cell phones across the board, we just, in the words of our dear brother Neil at NYU, we amuse ourselves to death. We stimulate and titillate ourselves to death. And it has little to do with the substantial issues of what it is to live a good life. Not just a smart life and a pleasurable life, but a good and wise life. And what it is to fight for justice. Very truncated conceptions of success and very impoverished conceptions of greatness or what one is faithful to. Most young people today talk about being successful. You ask them, what are you faithful to? What are you going to use your success for? Well, what do you think? You know, for myself and my friends, and no, something beyond that. Oh, I can't wait to make $100 million. What you going to do with it? Well, what do you think? I got Bentleys and Lamborghinis and mansions and trophy spouses. That's what I'm after. Oh, you need to read some Dorothy Day. Get your spirit intact. Distraction generates escapist orientations, but most importantly, it downplays the centrality of courage. So the courageous ones almost look as if it's not just they're abnormal, but it's like they have lost touch with reality. I get a lot of people, I mean, it's interesting, I look on the internet every once in a while because I've never owned a computer. And they got a whole thing, is Brother Cornel West mentally ill? Yeah, what do I say? Hell yes! Given your conception of sanity, I'm mentally ill. But you see how that marginalizes folks so easy? So even young people who want to be drum majors for justice. And it's not just in the social realm, it's also in the private realm. You see that I come out of a tradition that put a stress on militant tenderness. Otis Redding said, try a little tenderness. Now say your name, say your name, say my name, say my name, say my name. Try a little tenderness. Radical gentleness, subversive sweetness. Listen to the voice of David Ruffin. Listen to the voice of Wanda Hutchinson of the emotions. There's a tenderness and a sweetness and a gentleness there that will touch your soul. That's why they call it soul music. And that's true for Frank Sinatra, working class Italian from Hoboken. It's true for Bing Crosby, working class brother from Spokane. Of course, they're deeply shaped by black voices, but they understood tenderness. You see it in Sondheim, and Hammerstein, and Bernstein on the musical stage. The music that's ain't right get to you because they're cultivating something other than just market calculation. And of course, for the avant-garde theater, even much deeper than that in its own ways, you see. But that's what the young folk oftentimes are detached from because they don't have access to it. And so therefore the awakening that is required, what you're talking about, this awakening, courageous coming together and bearing witness is something that for them is far removed. And then the market culture tries to erase memory. So you ask folks, who is Dorothy Day? Who is Rabbi Joshua? Who is David Reynolds? Who is Phil and Daniel Barrigan? I saw them in a magazine once and had something to do with jail. Can't remember exactly what it was, but had something to do with it. Didn't they go to jail once? And of course, I've lectured with folk asking, well, Brother West, who is this Malcolm the 10th? No, that's an X. That's an X. That's because they want a slave name. And it's true, we black folk, we don't know our real names. Brother James got it, and then Abdul as well from Freedom Fighter. Seriously, get this brother a hand, coming on the floor all the way down from Ithaca. That's him. All the way down from Ithaca. They got a trial in Syracuse. We behind them, fighting drones and others. But he's got a slave name, he's got his own name that he chose, but it's complicated because even the slave name is tied into a love because he's not going to forget the love of his mama and his daddy and his grandmama and his granddaddy and the folk in community he loved him. Ain't that right though, brother?
That's right, brother, but I thought that was between me and you.
I'm sorry. No, but it's out of love though, it's out of deep love though. So you inspire me.
Yes, sir.
You inspire me, my brother. There ain't no doubt about that.